Good evening, everybody. The first thing is to excuse the slightly spooky atmosphere of this video. I'm filming it in the dark, and the computer is struggling to cope with the lack of light. So let's just say it's a pre-Halloween video. Goodness me, a little fly just flew across there. Wow, how cool. Anyway, so your homework for Friday is to do a bit of research on this idea of the American dream, and I thought I'd help you out a little bit with that by doing this kind of mini lecture on the American dream. So I'll start off by giving you a definition of it and then talk about where the idea came from, about how we can see it at work in American history, and then also at the end maybe talk a little bit about this kind of opposite idea that's sometimes referred to as the American nightmare. So let's start off with a kind of definition. What is the American dream? Well, it's one of the central ideas, in some ways, the central ethos of the United States. And it's this idea that you have the freedom, or each individual has the freedom to achieve success, to achieve upward social mobility through his or her hard work. So this idea, I'm sure you've heard of it before, that you can start at the bottom of society and, in theory at least, become a millionaire by working hard at it. So that's what the American dream is. And the interesting thing is you can see this idea of the American dream from the very beginnings of the United States. So as you know, the first settlers from England at that time sailed across the Atlantic in the early 1600s to set up their first colonies in the United States. And why did they leave England? Why did they leave Europe? Well, because they were so-called Puritans, a strict religious grouping, and they were subject to religious persecution in England. So they wanted to have the freedom to practice their faith as they wanted to live it, and so they went to do that in the United States. So from the very beginning, America was a place where you went if you wanted the freedom to do things your own way, to achieve what you could achieve and what you wanted to achieve. Then, of course, we see it in really central American documents like the Declaration of Independence from 1776, 4th of July 1776. That's why the 4th of July is a holiday in the United States. And let me just quote from that. These are quotes I'm sure you're familiar with. All men are created equal. Well, why is that important? Because if everybody is created equal, then everybody has the possibility to achieve anything, to achieve success, if you like. And in case you're wondering, the word men here is being used in its rather old-fashioned meaning to mean all human beings. So it's not really exclusive of women. Then also in the Declaration of Independence, you have this goal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the third of those is, in this context, the most important. The pursuit of happiness. If you have this right to pursue happiness, and of course you have the right to achieve success if you work hard at it. You can also see it a bit later on in American history in the course of the 19th century, this idea of the West and the frontier, which you may know from cowboy films. This was a huge, more or less empty continent, which offered huge possibilities to people who were willing to take their own destiny into their own hands, move west, set up their household there on the empty land and achieve something new. And of course, you had things like the gold rush in California in 1848, people moving west with this dream of getting rich quick by discovering gold. So you can basically see it throughout the whole of American history, this idea of being able to better yourself by hard work. And if you look at 20th century, more recent American history, you can, of course, see many examples of that. So America has always been a very socially mobile society in both directions, it has to be said. But it's comparatively, or it's historically been comparatively easy to make your fortune there, but also to lose your fortune. And you can see that with modern examples, people like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, who started not necessarily in poverty, but not with a privileged background, and who achieved fantastic levels of wealth through their own genius, their own talent, and their hard work. You can also see it in Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King in the context of race relations, the rights of African Americans. And I'm sure you know his speech, "I Have a Dream." Well, of course, there's a link between this dream and the American dream. Well, what Martin Luther King's dream was to make the ideal of the American dream available to African Americans as well, who'd been excluded from that dream because of the history of slavery and discrimination and segregation that there'd been in the United States, in particular in the southern states. So you can really see it throughout American history. What are the negative sides of it? Well, the first is this idea, if everyone has the freedom to become rich, then it means that their destiny is in their own hands. Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing, because if you're hardworking and talented, you can make it. On the other hand, who's to blame if you fail? If theoretically everyone has the possibility of becoming successful and you fail, then surely you only have yourself to blame. And as you know, American society is much more tolerant than most European societies of differences in wealth, and is more tolerant of people living in the streets. State benefits for the poor are lower than in Europe, in some cases non-existent. And of course, that's the flip side of the American dream. So if everyone's free to make it, everyone is free to fail as well. And it's this kind of negative side of the American dream that's often referred to as the American nightmare. So examples of the American nightmare would be the higher levels of poverty compared to European society, but also all the people who were historically left behind by the ideal of the American dream. So, for example, this movement westward, the frontier westward, all these people moving into the supposedly empty land of America. Well, it wasn't really empty, was it? Because it had been populated and was still populated by the Native Americans. So what happened was close to being a genocide of Native Americans. That's the flip side of people moving west to get rich. The same thing with slaves, in particular in the southern states. There were huge fortunes to be made on the plantations, for example, but those fortunes could only be made by the exploitation of slaves, so who were imported from Africa, and indeed the exploitation of poor white people. So again, there was a flip side to this wealth in society. And if you take these three things in particular, racial discrimination of African Americans, the genocide or near genocide of Native Americans, and this kind of acceptance of poverty that you get in American society, I think it's fair enough to talk of this idea of the American nightmare. Let's just finish off with a last positive example that's often mentioned, Barack Obama. So in some ways, he was a fulfillment of Martin Luther King's version of the American dream. A black man became president of the United States, and maybe the American dream, at least in some cases, is still alive. So I hope that helped you understand the idea of the American dream a little bit. We'll talk about it soon in our lessons. That was the end of this spooky Halloween lecture.